John 12, I'm not even going to take the time to explain the first 19 verses. I want to dive right into verse number 20. So I want to pick up right there. A lot to be said this morning, so I don't want to waste any time. So we'll just look at verse number 20, and I'm going to go from there. If you need to know what was said last time, it is on YouTube, and you can look it up anytime you want. It is there, and I'd encourage you to do that. John 12, verse number 20. Now there were certain Greeks among those who came up to worship at the feast. The feast is the Passover feast, the big annual gathering of the Jewish people. And as I had mentioned last time, this was one of the largest in history. Upwards to 2.5 million people cramming into the old city of Jerusalem. And obviously many of them are from far without side of Jerusalem itself, traveling from different sections of the Roman Empire. And here you have Greeks. It doesn't tell us where these individuals are coming from. Perhaps from the west, perhaps from the east, perhaps from the northern Galilee region. We don't really know, and that's beside the point. The point is this. These are non-Jewish people, proselytes presumably, who are coming to the feast because they believe in God, the Jewish God, the Hebrew God. They have abandoned their pagan gods and they have embraced the God of gods. And they are traveling to Jerusalem, perhaps maybe even because they've heard the stories of Jesus. More likely it's because they are believers in God and they have traveled across the span of the empire, possibly to come to Jerusalem on this pilgrimage, to come to this feast. And as they arrive, they hear all of the stories of Jesus. Because that's all the buzz. That's why it's such a big crowd. People from Galilee and all throughout the Judean region. They're cramming in. They want to see what's next. If he raised Lazarus from the dead, what is he going to do next? They've already been cutting palm branches down and laying it on the street. They've laid their clothes down on the highway as he comes across the Kidron Valley and works his way up into the eastern gate. And they are calling for him to be the king. Hosanna in the highest. They want to coronate him and they want him to rule. Not in the sense that we would think rule in a spiritual sense, to save us from our sins and to redeem us and to restore us from our lost and depraved nature. That's the furthest thing from their minds. They're thinking of liberation from Rome. They're thinking from the economic tyranny of the empire. They want to see life restored as it once was under King David or King Solomon. They want to see the empire of Israel outgrow the empire of Rome. That's what they're looking for. And they're excited. It's the possibility of this kingdom. It's already been foretold. Daniel spoke of this. Isaiah spoke of this. Ezekiel spoke of this. Zephaniah spoke of this. All throughout the Psalms, it was spoken of this, that the Messiah would come and that he would establish an everlasting kingdom. It would be a global kingdom. And it would be a kingdom that he would rule supreme for all of eternity. And they are in presumption that this is that moment. This is that time that kingdom will be established and that this man must be that king. He must be that Messiah for the Jewish people. So they're in great expectation. And in the midst of this Jewish expectation, you have Gentiles. And John is keen on focusing regularly on Gentile interaction. This is one of the reasons why he is writing this particular epistle. This is a what you would call Catholic gospel. When I say Catholic, I mean universal, not Catholic in the sense of the Catholic Church, but Catholic in the sense that it is universal. That's what that word means. It is not just a Jewish gospel, it is a universal gospel to all peoples, all tribes, all tongues, all languages, all peoples throughout all times. And so John is pointing out that even Greeks are showing up and they are there to worship and they want to see Jesus. It's interesting, if you read Matthew's account, he tells us that Gentiles from the east traveled from afar to see Jesus when he was born. And as John is closing his account, we see that Gentiles once again are traveling from afar who want to see Jesus. So how do I know they want to see Jesus? Well, look at verse 21. Then they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida, and asked him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. We want to have company with Jesus. We wish to meet with him. Now, I want to point out something, first of all, that is often overlooked. It says, then they came to Philip. Philip is mentioned here. Philip's one of the 12 disciples. It's interesting to me because Matthew's account mentions Philip one time and only by name, says nothing about him. Mark's account mentions Philip one time and only by name and never mentions anything else about him. And Luke's account mentions Philip one time, only by name, and never mentions anything about him. You come to John's account and he mentions him not one time, not 2 times, not 3 times, 12 times, and has a lot to say about Philip. Why is that? Well, Philip, he is a Jew, but he has a Greek name. And Philip, basically what is presented about him is interesting in regards to God's relationship and the gospel's relationship to the Gentile and Greek community. And this is what first of all, this is why he mentions from Bethsaida. This is where Philip is from. This is also where Andrew and Peter, brothers, are from. Andrew also being a Greek name. And this is where they live. This is a far northern town of the Sea of Galilee. It's on the far eastern northern side of it. And it's very, very close to Gentile Greek-speaking territory. In all likelihood, within Bethsaida, which is a fishing town, it means the house of fishermen. In all likelihood, Bethsaida was a town that had living in it in the first century those that were Jews and Gentiles. Those who were Greeks and those who were Hebrews. And maybe even Philip spoke Greek himself. And when it says that they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida, and asked him, saying, we wish to see Jesus. Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Which, by the way, years ago, I was visiting a church, large church, and on the wall behind the podium here was that statement, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. And it was huge. Took up the whole wall. Sir, we wish to see Jesus. And I loved it because as you're sitting in the audience, you see the pastor, but right above the pastor's head was that statement, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. And it served as a constant reminder to the congregation. It's not about the pastor. It's all about Jesus. And I'm only here because I want you to see Jesus, not me. I'm just the mailman delivering the message, delivering the mail. It's all about Jesus. So they come to him and they say, we wish to see Jesus. And the contrast to this from those in Jerusalem, particularly the religious leaders, is massive. If you remember the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 12 and verse number 38, they come to Jesus and they say, we want to see a sign. We don't care about you. We just want to see a sign. Do a magic trick for us. It's these Gentiles that are more spiritual in heart who are coming and say, we just want to see you. We want to talk to you. We want to know you better. We don't want just some magic trick. We don't want to see some miracle. We don't want to see some sign. We want to see you. We want you. Now, why do they come to Philip? That's the big question here. Why Philip? Why not just go to Jesus? Well, there's a couple of reasons possibly. You got to remember in the temple there, it's divided in sections. And one of the sections is the court of the Gentiles, and that's probably as far as these guys could go. They're there for the feast, and they're there in the court of the Gentiles, and perhaps, in all likelihood, Jesus is in the court of the Jewish men. And so they come to Philip, who has a Greek name, possibly knowing that Philip speaks Greek. They come to him and they say, we want to have a company with Jesus. We want to meet with Jesus. Now, it's odd that in verse number 22, it says, Philip came and told Andrew, another Bethsaidian. Why did he not just take these Greeks to Jesus? Why did he hesitated? It's like he didn't know what to do. He's like, well, let me consult with Andrew and find out what I should do. I think there's possibly 2 reasons why this is the case. If you remember back in Matthew chapter 10 and verse number 5, Jesus sends his disciples out 2 by 2 to preach the kingdom of heaven. And he gives them instructions in that passage. He says, do not go into the way of the Gentiles and do not enter the city of the Samaritans. So that was the message he gave to his disciples. I want you to go preach the kingdom of heaven, but don't go to the Gentiles. And don't go into the region of the Samaritans. Go to the house of Israel, go to the Jewish people and preach the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That was the message that was given to the disciples. Later on in Matthew chapter 15 and verse number 24, Jesus himself said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That's the other reason. We were told not to preach to the Gentiles. We were told not to go to the Samaritans. And Jesus himself said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So maybe Philip was like, wow, there's Gentiles who want to have an audience with Jesus. I don't really know what to do here. I'm not sure what I should do. So he goes to Andrew and he consults with Andrew. And in turn, it says, verse 22 at the end of it, Andrew and Philip told Jesus. So Andrew did what Andrew always does. He took Philip to Jesus. When I say always, this is what you always see him doing. In chapter 1, just verse number 41, Andrew takes Philip to Jesus. In chapter 6, verses 8 and 9, he's taking the young lad to Jesus. Every time you see Andrew, that's what he's doing. He's actively taking people to Jesus. Not a lot recorded in Scriptures about Andrew, by the way. What is recorded is that he takes people to Jesus. In fact, one of the number one things that history has preserved for us about the person and work of Andrew as a disciple is that he brings people to Jesus. Wouldn't you love for that to be? If history records nothing else about your life other than that your life was spent bringing people to Jesus, wouldn't that be a great testimony? Wouldn't that be the most wonderful thing that you were remembered for? That you brought people to Jesus? So here you have Andrew bringing Philip to Jesus. Verse number 23, Jesus answers. But as is always the case with Jesus, he seemingly never answers the way you think that he will. He almost never responds the way that you think that he is going to. I think this is a clear sign that he's divine. If a human were writing a story about a fictitious figure like Jesus, the responses that Jesus would give would have been a lot more human, a lot more natural, a lot more common. And yet every time you read the responses of Jesus in the gospel, you're like, who would have thought to say that? Where are you coming from? What a change of tune here. So verse number 23 rather, Jesus answered them saying, the hour has not come, or the hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Well, that's odd. So they come to him. Hey, Jesus, there's a bunch of Greek, Gentile guys that want to talk to you. What do you think? The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. If I were Philip and Andrew, I would have stood there with a blank stare for a minute and probably would have responded with, yeah, that's good. Now back to the question that, what do you think? It's like, are you ignoring me? The hour has come. Which, that should have been a clue to them, by the way, because multiple times throughout the ministry of Jesus, his 3 years of ministry, he had been telling them, my hour has not yet come. My hour is not yet here. Chapter 2, verse number 4, he says, my hour has not yet come. Chapter 7, and verse number 30, it says, because his hour had not yet come. Chapter 8, verse number 20, it says, no one laid hands on him, for his hour had not yet come. Even God was restraining those that wanted to stone him to death. Why? Because his hour had not yet come. There was a time, a divine providential time for him to be crucified, to be buried, and to be resurrected from the dead. And Jesus' response to these two disciples, who says, hey, should you meet with these Gentiles? His response is, this hour is reserved for me to be glorified. Now, I don't believe that they interpreted that the same way he presented it. I don't believe that when he said that, they saw him meaning death. I don't think that they saw that as meaning crucifixion. I believe that perhaps their minds were drawn back to the prophecies of Daniel, who talked about the Messiah to come very clearly, very precisely. And in Daniel chapter 7 and verse number 13, it says, and Daniel says, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. And in that passage, it's clearly speaking of the Messiah, saying that when he comes, he will be given dominion and glory. And that glorification will spread to all the ends of the earth, and that glorification will destroy all of his enemies, and it will be a kingdom that will be established for all of eternity. In all likelihood, that's what emerged in their minds when he says, the hour has come for me to be glorified. Oh, finally, a clue. Finally, he's saying the kingdom is coming. Finally, he's admitting it's going to happen. He keeps talking all this silly talk about dying and raising from the dead 3 days later, and the temple being crushed and all this kind of crazy talk. Finally he's saying something that makes sense. He's going to be glorified and his kingdom is going to be established. But when Jesus spoke of being glorified, he wasn't referring to the kingdom, at least not the physical one, a spiritual one per se. He was referring more to the cross. Luke chapter 24, verse number 25, you have Jesus after his resurrection. He's walking on this road to Emmaus. There's two followers of Christ that he comes alongside of, and he talks to them. And he tells them in verse number 25, O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? In other words, this glory that you were awaiting for, that you were anticipating, the glory of a king, the glory of a kingdom, that was not at all what the prophets were saying at the first ascending of Christ. No, they were talking about his death, his suffering. Even Daniel 9 refers to that. He will be cut off when he comes. He will be put to death. And at that moment, he begins to open the scriptures, it says in verse 27, and beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them all that the scriptures, the things that the scriptures said concerning him. So on the road to Emmaus, Jesus rebukes these disciples and says, look, you fools, you are not paying attention to the details. And the details are all pointing from Moses on throughout all the prophets are saying that when I come, I would die, I would be buried, and I would raise again from the dead. And he expounds these truths to his followers from the scriptures. Now Jesus uses this opportunity of these Gentiles wanting to have an audience with him and his response to his disciples as a moment to give a brilliant, genius, perfect, I think is a better way of putting it, a perfect illustration. If you would look at verse number 24. This perfect illustration summarizes this truth in the best possible way. He says, most assuredly. In other words, a true truth I give you. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. Now, I know the disciples at this moment, they're not the brightest, tools in the box. They don't, they're, as I heard a lot growing up, they're one fry short of a Happy Meal. They're not all there exactly. They don't follow along. These were the guys that rode the short bus to school, so to speak. They were all, time and time again, they were slow to coming to understanding. And I have no doubt in my mind that they're standing there dumbfounded. What does this have to do with whether or not you're going to meet with the Gentiles? Whether or not you're going to talk to these Greek fellows over here? What does this have anything to do with this? Well, let me point it out. Verse 24 once again. Most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. Remains alone, it means basically nothing changes. Unless that seed is put into the ground, germinates, watered, and goes through its metamorphosis, unless that happens, nothing changes with the seed. It just remains a seed. It remains ineffective. Nothing grows out of it. There's no fruit from it. It's virtually useless as it's just a dry seed. But unless it is put in the ground and dies, and that's kind of important there, dies. You say, well, seeds can't die. Seeds are dead already. That's not technically true. Seeds are alive. This is something I didn't even know until recent years. I was corrected about a year or two ago. I was talking about dead seeds, and somebody's like, no. It was a biologist who said, seeds are alive. There's an embryo within the seed, and it can remain alive for, depending on how much energy is stored inside of the dry shell of the seed, it can remain alive for many years. Most seeds up to 5 years before it eventually will die of decay or be eaten. But some seeds can last up to 100 years, more than that. And they're in this state of what is called dormant resting. Another technical term would be it is in suspended animation. It has slowed down the processes of its decay, and it remains in that state for an extended period of time so that eventually in the future it can bring life. It can be rebirthed. And so you have a seed that within it is an embryo. It has a baby plant within the seed. And in the right conditions, if it is planted in the ground and it is germinated and it dies, it can bring forth life, much life, in fact, produces even more life. You say, how long can a seed last? A lot longer than you might realize. A couple years ago, there was a discovery in Herod's palace that was being excavated in Israel. Some seeds of 2,000-year-old date palms. And they took one of those seeds of a date palm and they planted it in Israel in 2005. Researchers wanted to see what would happen. The seeds appeared to be in good condition as they examined them and said, well, I wonder what would happen if we planted it. And they planted it outside in Israel. And you could drive to Israel today, or fly to Israel today, and that tree is there. In 2005, they planted it, it germinated, it sprouted, it grew, and there is a date palm tree growing in Israel today that originally was alive 2,000 years ago. And because it was put into the ground and it died, and when I say die, you say, well, how does a seed die? Well, death means that it ceases to be what it once was. The seed itself, the shell, the whole thing ceases to exist. It goes into full decay and it becomes something entirely different. It metamorphoses into something entirely new. It is a new creation. And unless that happens, that seed, if it's not planted, if it's not germinated, if it's not watered, if it doesn't get sun and air, it will just remain a seed, useless, powerless, ineffective, all by itself. But under the right conditions, and the main condition being death, is that it will produce much fruit. So you say, what does that have to do, once again, with the Greeks? Well, follow along with me here. In fact, some of you, as I'm telling this whole process here, you might be, at least if you're anything like me, this is what came to my mind while I was studying this verse. Star Wars. I was thinking of Obi-Wan Kenobi. You remember when when Obi-Wan Kenobi's fighting Darth Vader there in the first movie? And he says to them, if you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you could ever possibly imagine. That's virtually the same thing that Jesus is saying here. If you strike me down, if you kill me, if I die, and in my death I will become immensely more powerful than you could ever imagine. This is why this is a perfect illustration. Unless you look at Jesus through the lens of the cross, you will never see the potential good to the world that he offers. You will never realize the immense power of Jesus until you view Jesus through the spectrum of the cross. Everything points to the cross. Everything surrounds the cross. It is the circumference of all theology pointing to it. This is why in the Old Testament and New Testament alike, this is why Paul says, I'm not ashamed of it. I preach the cross. It's all about the cross. If you don't understand the cross, you don't understand the power of God. And so he says, just like a seed that is planted, dies, there is immense life that comes out of it because of it. Now, what is the point he's getting to? The point that he's getting to is this. These Gentiles want to seek me now, and I could become their king now. It's a prime moment for Jesus. There are thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands cramming into the city from the Galilean region. They want him to be king. There are those within Jerusalem who want him to be king. There are Gentiles who would like for him to be king. Seize the moment, you might think. Consolidate all these forces together. Become king. Overpower those who want to destroy you. Overpower Judas. Overpower the Sanhedrin. Overpower those that are of the religious elites. Overpower them. You have the crowds now to back you up. You have an army. Establish your kingdom now. He could do that. Certainly he could do that. It wouldn't be an eternal kingdom. It wouldn't be a spiritual kingdom. It wouldn't be the perfect kingdom. Sure, I could meet these Greeks right now and we could talk talk about getting together and consolidating our forces and establishing this kingdom and ruling the world supreme. But that's so short term. That's not looking at the big picture. That's not realizing that there are eternal souls at stake here. That's not realizing that there's heaven and hell that needs to be dealt with. That's not looking to the future generations. That's not dealing with the main issue, death and sin and Satan. And so you're thinking so small. It's too small. This is what he's telling his disciples. This is not the time. There's bigger things going on. There's a bigger agenda at hand right now. And the biggest of them all, I must die. I must die. And if I don't die, nothing good, nothing eternally good will happen. This is also true for you. And Jesus used this opportunity to twist the focus around to you. Notice what he says in verse number 25. He who loves his life will lose it. And he who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Now maybe you're like me. In recent weeks, I've engaged in warfare. I've been losing, I'll admit it, I have been losing. And maybe you have been battling some of the same enemies that I have, and you are losing as well. The enemies that I'm referring to are dandelions. That they at night, they come into your yard, and they slowly start to take over. And I take my little dandelion stick, little plucker stick, and I go out in the front yard like an idiot and bend down on my knees, and I kill every one of them. I go out there like a madman, destroying every dandelion I can. I come back, a couple of days later, they're all there again. I was like, what happened? I murdered every one of you. In the morning, I get my coffee, I open the window, I see all these flowers sprouting. I don't think of them as flowers. They look more like shields to me. They're like the little warriors out there opening their shields. They're like, give us your best. Like, you're going to lose again. There's no winning. There's no winning. And I've realized that, particularly after studying this passage, the problem is not the plant. The problem is the seed. I can't get rid of the seeds. Every time no matter how hard I try, the seeds, they keep coming back. And it's like I can't find the seeds in the grass. They're there, and they're going to plant themselves in the dirt. They're going to die, and they're going to produce another army of dandelions that I have no control over. It's the seeds that has more power. And they only express and show and reveal their power when they die. In your Christian walk with Christ, when you die to yourself, that is when God's power shows up in your life. When you set aside your own agendas and your own focus and your own ambitions in life, and you say, I'm dying to my plans, I'm dying to my goals, I'm dying to myself. It's whatever you want, it's whatever you lead, it's wherever you put me, God. It's you first, me last. You must increase, I must decrease. When you die to yourself, there's a seed that is planted, and God uses it to produce an army for Him. God uses it to produce much fruit for Him. This is why He says, he who loves his life will lose it. If you live your life for yourself, you're clamoring and scraping and clawing and pursuing everything that will give you self-pleasure, you'll find yourself one day miserable, never fulfilled, always grasping at the wind, always pursuing things that make you happy, but they never ultimately do. As long as life is all about you, you will be the world's biggest loser. But the moment you decide to throw up the white flag of surrender, and you say, my life is yours, I give it up, he who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. That's a Semitic expression, by the way. It is a Jewish way of saying God first. Not man first, not me first, it is God first. And this is a key subject. This is a key message of Jesus. Matthew chapter 10 and verse number 37, Jesus said, he who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son and daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take up his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. When was the last time you heard those verses read in church? Certainly not popular, are they? They don't give you those warm, fuzzy feelings inside. It is a call to take up your cross and follow Him. The German theologian, I think of Bonhoeffer, who once said, a call to follow Jesus is a call to die. That's what He calls us to do. He calls us to die. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it. You want to find life? You want to find purpose of life? You want to find fruitfulness of life? You want to find meaning to life? You want to find joy in life? You want to find prosperity in your life? You have to give up your life. Surrender it to Him. Allow Him to fill you, lead you, guide you. The rich young ruler, although he had everything, he seemed to be a moral person, and he seemed to have all the possessions of life that one might want, and yet there was still an empty void within him. He still felt lost within himself, and so he comes to Christ. He says, what do I need to do? Jesus tells him, be obedient to God's law, which he had not. He was self-deceived. But in verse number 21 of Mark 10, it says, then Jesus, looking at him, loved him. He didn't say this because he hated him. He said this because he loved him. Sometimes hard truth, hard love. You have to say the things that hurt because you love people. He loved him, and he said to him, one thing you lack. Go your way, sell whatever you have, and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, take up the cross, and follow me. Basically, he was pointing out to this young rich ruler, you think you have put me first in your life. You think that you have put God first in your life. But the truth is you're not willing to give up your riches. The truth is you're not willing to take up your cross and follow me. The truth is you are not willing to put me first in life. And that, unfortunately, could be true of a lot of us. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul said it this way, foolish one, what you sow is not made alive unless it dies. The body is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. And you can live your life pursuing all the natural materialistic things you want. You will never be satisfied. That is a fool's errand. But if you die to self and embrace God, then you will be raised a spiritual body. And don't you realize that all of your longings of life are spiritual in nature? I've said this so many times as a pastor, and it's a truth that you should never forget. It will help you make better decisions in life. You will never satisfy the soul's needs, the soul's longings, the soul's cravings and wants in life by providing material means to them. The soul is your soul. It's a spiritual realm. It is a spiritual longing. It is a spiritual desire that you're looking for. It is spiritual fulfillment that you're longing for. Going about filling it with careers and cars and hobbies and vacations are all, once again, fool's errands. They lead to dead ends. You can only fill the void with the spiritual realm, and there's only two spiritual realms, that of Satan and that of God's. And Satan's doesn't end well. So pursue God. Put Him first. Romans chapter 12, verse number 1 says this, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. I was thinking about that passage this morning, and this phrase came to my mind, so I jotted it down. I offer this in honor of the sacrifices you made for me. So my thought process was this. Every time I do something sacrificial, I should do it as an act of worship. I should do it as an act of praise. And I should tell God that. I offer this in honor of the sacrifices you made for me. What I mean by that is this. So you give an offering to God, let's say, on a Sunday morning. You can sit there in your seat and you can say, I offer this in honor of the sacrifices you made for me. Let's say you choose to be more faithful to church. Lord, I'm going to make sure that every week I'm in the house of God, worshiping you, acknowledging you, learning of you. I'm going to be faithful to church. And you can say, I do this in honor of the sacrifices you gave for me. It's the motive behind it. That's the point I'm getting to, a motive. I'm going to honor you with my life. And here's how I'm going to do it, this sacrifice, whatever it may be. I'm going to cut this thing out of my life. I'm going to spend more time in prayer. I'm going to spend more time in your word. I'm going to tell more people about the gospel. I'm going to do this in honor of the sacrifices you made for me. I wonder what kind of sacrifices are you willing to make for Christ in honor of the sacrifices Christ was willing to make for you? It's a response, as Michael had pointed out. It's a response. That's what worship is. It's a response. You did this. I want to do this in response. That's why we do what we do. Well, I've got a lot to say, so I need to bring this to a close. Look at verse number 26. If anyone serves me, let him follow me. And where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, him my Father will honor. Do you want God to honor you, acknowledge you, to know you, to bless your life? If anyone serves me, let him follow me. There's a lot of people say, I serve God. I'm a believer in God. But you have to, as John the Baptist had pointed out, there needs to be fruit that gives evidence to that. And the evidence is that you are following him. Or as Jesus said in Luke chapter 9, verse 23, if anyone desires to come after me, and that's a good desire. I hope you have that desire. Do you have a desire to come after Jesus? Do you have a desire to follow Jesus this morning? I hope. It'd blow my mind if there are people in this room right now who have no desire to follow Jesus. What a foolish thought. I hope all of us have a desire to follow Jesus. But if that's your desire, pay attention to these words. He says, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and is himself destroyed or lost? In other words, what profit is it to gain the whole world and lose your soul? Why live for a world that is fleeing away, disappearing? The question that we need to be asking ourselves this morning is this: do you desire to be comfortable or conformable? Did you come to church this morning looking to be comfortable, or did you come to church this morning wanting to be conformable to His image, conforming more to be like Him? Or is your Christian life revolving around what can make me comfortable as a Christian? Well, how about waking up tomorrow and deciding whatever leads me to being more conformed to His image, no matter how much sacrifice, no matter how much it cost me, no matter how much I lose in the process, I want to be conformed to Him, not comfortable. There'll be an eternal state called heaven that we will dwell in for all of eternity, where you will certainly be in comfort. But you don't live in that state right now, and we're not living at this moment and for this mission for that reason. He said, if you want to save your life, you got to lose it. If the answer is conformable, then you need to be like the seed that is planted in God's Word, nourished and watered, and allow the Word of God to bring that seed of desire to death to be raised into newness of life. Look at verse 27. I'm trying to close this, folks, I promise you. Verse 27. Now my soul is troubled. That word troubled means is shaken. He's trembling. It's a strong, passionate Greek word here. He is, in fact, as I was meditating on this earlier, this right here may be the deepest point of temptation that Jesus ever faced in His life. We always think about the 40 days in the wilderness where He's tempted by Satan. This here might be that moment where He's tempted even more. My soul is troubled. And this precedes the time where He goes into the garden and He prays and He sweats, as it were, great drops of blood. His soul is troubled, and it says, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I came to this hour. And he knows what lies ahead. The wrath of God poured in its full, complete, unadulterated anger towards the sins of humanity poured out in its full propitiation on Him. He knows what He's about to face on the cross. It wasn't the hanging on the cross that made Him tremble. It was taking on the sins of all of humanity, knowing that God would turn His face away from Him. What is he thinking at this moment? As a human, what is he thinking? I could just establish the kingdom now. They're all here. They all want me to be king. I just get this thing going now. Do we really have to go to the cross? Is there some other way, he prays in the garden later? Is there some other way? But you remember what he prayed at the end of that. Nevertheless, not my will be done, but thine be done. This is the temptation, humanly speaking, but divinely, he says, I'm going to die to what I want, humanly speaking. I'm going to do what you want, divinely speaking. And what shall I say? By the way, when you're faced with not knowing what to do in life and you're trembling yourself, the key is always to run to the Father and pray. It's always the key. So he prays to the Father. And as he prays, he's reminded, this is why I came. This is the purpose that I'm here. And at the end of his prayer, it becomes very clear. He chooses to wear a crown, or he chooses to not wear a crown so that he can carry a cross instead. That's the end result of this prayer. Because he says in verse number 28, Father, glorify your name. That means do what you're going to do. Put the spotlight on you. Therefore the people, verse number 29, who stood by and heard it, or let me finish verse number 28, then a voice came from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. This is God the Father saying, I have been glorifying my name. I will continue to glorify my name. Verse 29, therefore the people who stood by heard it and said, it's thunder. And others said, an angel has spoken to him. Jesus answered and said, this voice did not come because of me, but for your sake. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. The judgment of this world is the judgment of sin. This is why he's come, to judge the sin of the world. And when he says, now the ruler of this world will be cast out, that's Satan. He will be crippled. He will be made powerless. In 1 John chapter 3, verse number 8, it says, for this purpose the Son of God was manifested, that he might destroy the works of the devil. That's why he came, to destroy the works of Satan. Verse 32 says, and if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself. If I'm lifted up on the cross, if I'm crucified, and we know that's what he's talking about because back in chapter number 3, that's what he refers to. It's an illustration of Moses lifting up the serpent in the desert. He says, I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to be lifted up on a cross. And if that happens, I will draw all people to myself. This is not a universal sense that all people will be saved. All people in the sense of all Greeks, all Gentiles, all barbarians, all men, all women, all children. They will all have access to the gospel. You want the Greeks to come talk to me right now? That's fine, but it's not effective. If I die, and if I'm buried, and if I'm raised again from the dead, there will be not just these Greeks that will have a relationship with me, not just these Gentiles that will have a relationship with me, but 2,000 years later, the Gentiles who are sitting in this room also will have a relationship with him. If I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. So closing it up this morning, verse 33, this he said, signifying by what death he should die. He announced he was going to die just days before he did it, and what kind of death that he would die. By the way, they all thought that he would be stoned to death. That was the way the Jews committed execution. That was the talk, that was the discussion among the Sanhedrin, that he will be stoned to death. And yet he announced to them, that's not the plan. The plan is I'll be crucified. We'll read 2 verses from Hebrews 12, and then I'll pray. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. When he asks you to die to self, when he asks you to give up this life so you'll gain the life to come, that might at times be discouraging to your soul. And this is why he says, consider him who did that. Jesus doesn't ask you to do something that he didn't himself do. He doesn't ask you to sacrifice in a way that he did not sacrifice. And if he received the reward from the Father for his sacrifice, he says you will receive the reward as well. So if your soul is burdened down and discouraged, don't be. Those that, like a seed, plant themselves in God, die to themselves, he will make fruitful and he will prosper them. One day Jesus died. One day Jesus was buried. One day Jesus rose again. And one day Jesus will come again. And for all of us who live our life selfishly, selflessly, putting him first, he will be magnified, he will be glorified in our life, and we will produce fruit by abiding in him.